Noubar, thank you so much for joining us. It's so great to have you today on the show. And what a big day. You just released new data showing your vaccine 94.5% effective. How game-changing is this?
Well, thanks for having me on, Emily. We think that this is highly encouraging as it relates to the possibility that our vaccine, and hopefully those of others, will have a profound impact on pushing back the damage that's being done by this virus. And the reason is because we need to attack this at the level of hundreds of millions of people, if not billions. This is not a treatment. This is, if you think about it this way, it's a preemptive treatment. In other words, your own immune system is going to defend you against the virus. And what we've shown is in a trial of 30,000 subjects, where we've already received some 95 cases of infection. In those, 90 of them were in a population that did not receive the vaccine, and only 5 were infections in the population that did. That's what the 94.5% protection comes from. And as that scales to millions and hundreds of millions of people, we should be able to save lives, avoid severe disease, we hope, and push back this pandemic.
So what are next steps, and when can you file for an emergency use authorization?
We're in close collaboration with the regulatory and other authorities, both for the authorization and the distribution of the vaccine. In terms of authorization, we will pursue an emergency use authorization, for which we still need to finalize gathering some safety data that will happen over the next days, and then prepare the file for review by the FDA, including the advisory committee, VRBPAC. That should happen in early December, we hope, if all goes as planned. And once we get the authorization, we're already ready with supplies and with the distribution to be able to start reaching out to the frontline workers and the population that the CDC deems appropriate to apply the first wave of vaccine to.
So when would that first wave be? When can people actually start getting the vaccine? When can my mom get the vaccine?
Well, it's hard for me to answer regarding any one person, but I can tell you that the vaccine will be distributed through the Operation Warp Speed supply chain that has been set up, and it will be available at first at the level of tens of millions of doses. I would suspect before the end of this year, some 20 to 40 million doses will be made available. We've already said 20 million of it will come from us. Then in going into the first quarter, that number should ramp up to as much as 50 to 100 million doses just from us. And that will ramp up through the year 2021 to 500 to 1 billion doses, at which capacity we are planning to operate. We won't be the only vaccine. There'll be other vaccines too. So as it relates to individuals receiving it, I would say the first wave will be the most vulnerable. The second wave will begin to be a bit broader. And I think in the second quarter of 2021, we should begin to see broader uptake. Now, we of course don't know to what extent people will hesitate in taking the vaccine. We hope this kind of data, both on the efficacy and safety end, together with proper communication and leadership at many levels from the medical community as well as the government, will lead people to take it up as much as possible. And so that will also dictate timing.
Now, there was a lot of excitement around the Pfizer news, which uses the same mRNA technology that Moderna uses, but then we learned it needs to be stored at negative 94 degrees Fahrenheit. Yours can be stored at refrigerator temperature for 30 days, as I understand it. What kind of advantage does that give you?
Well, I should say, Emily, that, Moderna pioneered this messenger RNA field and has worked in it for 10 years and has worked on nothing else. There are many people who have entered the field more recently who are using technologies that we used and looked at some years ago. And we've spent quite a bit of effort trying to actually achieve the minus 20 degrees centigrade target, the minus 4 degrees Fahrenheit, which is our long-term storage conditions, already something that can be done quite broadly because that capability exists. And then, of course, what you just mentioned, which is we announced today, the results, just-in results on our storage conditions, where it's clear that not only can we keep things at minus 4 degrees Fahrenheit, but we can also keep things under refrigeration for up to 30 days. And in fact, even more so for 12 hours, we can have it at room temperature sitting on a table. And what that means is that, you know, we want to take the pressure off of the distribution system, both to try to do unusual things, avoid it, but also not to feel the stress of getting things wrong. Because every one of these vaccines is going to be precious, because there will be a limited supply for a prolonged period of time. So we don't want 10 vials to go bad or 100 vials because people didn't approach it properly. So that, you know, I'd say that this is not a recent innovation for us. Moderna has some 10 other vaccines that it's put into the clinic over the last few years. And the COVID-19 one is the beneficiary of all of that experience and innovation applied to something at a scale we never imagined we'd have to work in.
That said, your vaccine also needs 2 doses, just like the Pfizer vaccine. And, you know, getting people to come back is going to be a challenge. You know, talk to us about your distribution plan, how much you think you can manufacture, and how challenging you think the process of just getting this out into the world will be.
Look, I think that there's a lot that's been done to prepare for this moment. I can say, for example, in the US, the work of Operation Warp Speed has been not just at the securing the supplies that we needed, the supplies that we will provide to the vaccine distribution program, but the entire distribution chain and the preparedness for that. So while there's a lot of work to do, I think we've already done quite a bit. And look, the idea about 2 doses, it's an interesting thing because just about everything related to vaccines these days has become a point of debate and speculation. But the reason we are using 2 doses is to give people the maximum amount of protection. When we set out to do this, we could well have done it with 1 dose. It's my own personal opinion based on data we have from animal work and others. But we chose 2, and we chose 100 microgram because we could. Why? Because we wanted the highest possible protection, because we anticipated the burden of disease would be so high, so terrible, that we just needed to flat out protect people. Turns out from there, you can back off, and you can begin to see, once you have something that just protects, as we've seen, 94.5% of the people, of the cases, now you can begin to say, okay, well, how much could I get away with just 1 dose? And could I do with giving 1 dose and then maybe monitor before I give another one? So there's a lot of ways this can go. You know, people have come along after the fact and said, we can do it with 1 dose. Well, let's foresee that they get the same kind of effective protection with 1 dose, and then let's compare. And by that time, I can tell you, I'm sure Pfizer and others will have multiple improvements without changing anything, just by doing trials to show whether and under what circumstances different dosing regimens may work. So I wouldn't think about this as much in a competitive advantage, disadvantage way, because it's not static. It's not like we launched our iPhone and somebody else launched their system and now we're going to compete based on it. It's just not a competition in that way. We have a lot of flexibility. And so
now, Moderna had virtually no revenue and no commercial products a year ago, and now here is emerging with potentially a leading vaccine candidate for COVID-19. Tell us a little bit more about where Moderna came from and how you started the company.
Well, look, Moderna is a product of a whole new different way of thinking about innovation that we employ at Flagship Pioneering, which is the firm that I established some 20 years ago with colleagues. And the idea there is to, rather than look at the way science advances incrementally, instead think about leaping to not yet discovered, not yet invented capabilities, and first figure out what would you wish you could do if you could do anything. And among the hundreds of such explorations we carry out every year, every 2 years, what we uncovered here was that if only you could provide to a human a code that will cause their own cells to make a protein that's either therapeutic or preventative, well, then that capability would be a significant advance over the state-of-the-art of biotechnology. And this was back in 2010. We didn't know how to do it. We didn't know how effective it would be, whether it would be safe, but we first envisioned that such an arbitrary, imaginary thing could be possible. And then we started working backwards. If you were going to do this, what would it take? Can we prove it? How robust is it, et cetera? That innovation process that we practiced, Flagship, this was actually the entity was called LS18. We number our projects. It was the 18th such life science project we had done. And it eventually became Moderna because we went into labs. We actually tried a number of approaches. Again, we were not looking for an application for a discovery. We were looking to make a discovery to fit an application that we got convinced would be transformative. And the first years were actually quite remarkable. In fact, yesterday when we got this data, my wife, who's lived with this for a long, long time, actually reminded me that the last time I was this moved was when we had mouse data, which was some 9 years ago. And you might say, boy, how could you compare mouse data to the human data? Well, guess what? If you can kind of dream up that some molecule could go into a mouse and enter its cells and make a protein, any arbitrary protein you want, that is transformative. It's almost like the rest follows. So there were early excitement that we could get. And then, of course, the rest has taken some 9 years to get to this point. Along the way, we have raised and deployed some $5 billion. We have grown to be about 1,200 people. And we've learned a lot. We've automated, we've digitized, we've done things that the biotech industry hasn't had to do because it has not been dealing fundamentally with an information molecule. Here you are with your background from San Francisco. Information is a transformative paradigm in and of itself. Imagine what happens when all drugs are basically based on information, not some arbitrary molecule that we hope will work without causing toxicity. Right. That's the industry we want to transform.
What was the eureka moment where you realized that mRNA, which is completely unique and new to the vaccine world and basically tricks the body into producing what it needs to fight without actually injecting the virus, what was the eureka moment that that was going to work?
You know, interestingly, you know, in the way we prosecute things from the future backwards, there isn't quite the eureka moment, simply because you have to imagine something can work and then go backwards and have it work. So when it works, it's not a big surprise. And when it doesn't work, it's not a big disappointment because you're not doing it one way, you're doing it 10 different ways. It might seem strange, but that's why it's hard for me to kind of recount a eureka moment. But let me answer the question in the following way. The idea of messenger RNA is that you take a code, you formulate it in a particular drug-like way, you enter the body with it, and it gets into the cells you want, and it starts making a protein. Theoretically, any protein, because every one of your cells can take any code and make any protein. By the way, parenthetically, this virus, the SARS-CoV-2 virus, is an mRNA-based virus. It's an RNA-based virus. It does the same thing. In fact, viruses have figured out how to do what it took the biotech industry 40 years to figure out how to do, which is to stick RNA in the body and then give the cells that they infect the code by which they can reconstitute themselves. So, I mean, the irony is not lost on us that the very thing that is going to undo, we hope, or do in the virus is going to be an innovation the virus had made to begin with. That is RNA going in, tricking the cell to think it's itself, make a protein, in our case, that wakes up the immune system. So vis-a-vis your eureka moment, I'll say very quickly that once we knew we could make proteins, then we started making many different proteins, of which some of them were originally against the flu. So what's been lost in all the coverage is that the very first human clinical trials Moderna ever did was to two strains of the bird flu, influenza, that had never entered humans. And we did it because we thought it's the safest thing to test, because long before a pandemic or an epidemic, we wanted to see whether we could create neutralizing antibodies. And back in 2015, we in fact showed that. So that's probably as close to a gratifying confirmatory moment as we had. But ironically, we didn't go after pathogens afterwards. We did some, we did Zika, we did various chikungunya, etc. But we started thinking about it more broadly, and we went after cancer vaccines. And I'll say, interestingly, that the cancer vaccine work also informed our technology, because in cancer vaccines, you have to very rapidly take a sequence from a human and quickly turn it into a vaccine. And that same process became the backbone of our very rapid response COVID-19 vaccine.
Now, there are some questions about the underlying IP and reporting that the NIH might own some of the patents that Moderna is using. Is that correct? What's the deal there?
The NIH has very productively for us been both a collaborator of ours and has worked on the underlying protein that is a vulnerability of this class of virus, which is called the spike, the S protein. And that protein they had worked on for many years for MERS vaccine, etc. Several years ago, we began to collaborate with them to actually develop a MERS vaccine, which was just about ready to get into phase 1 human trials when the SARS-CoV-2 hit earlier this year. And in fact, that same team and Moderna immediately decided to collaborate to change the protein sequence to the one from this virus and not its cousin virus, and that benefited us. Now, from an intellectual property standpoint, the NIH and others have filed proteins that are kind of broad background proteins on the spike protein, which, by the way, everybody is using the spike protein, so that'll be an important thing. Beyond that, the mRNA vaccine that we make takes advantage of many inventions that we've made, including for this, excuse me, COVID-19 vaccine. And that is intellectual property that Moderna has. And in fact, Emily, you may know that Moderna announced that we will essentially not enforce our patents against others who are using messenger RNA, because in fact, we have patents that date back many, many years for the broad platform, the modifications, as well as the specific mRNA that's used for this particular vaccine. But we've decided that during a pandemic, we cannot enforce those patents. So in fact, we've enabled others. That's kind of what I can tell you about the lay of the land in terms of the patents that are important.
Now, stock sales of the executives of some of the biggest pharma companies that are working on vaccines have been scrutinized. And I know that your fund, which is a huge shareholder in Moderna, sold some stock earlier this year. What is your response to that?
Look, so there are things people have said about individual decisions. Of course, in our case, Flagship was the founding institution and owned all of the company in the very beginning. And in fact, as we formulated the initial founding group with certain academic co-founders, we distributed some shares to them, and that's how the company got started. So actually, it's not Flagship's ownership is a founding ownership. It's not a investment ownership per se. Having said that, our investors basically invest in closed-end funds, and at appropriate intervals, at appropriate open market situations, we've made small amounts of sales. In this case, it was a small fraction of our sales, which we effectuated. That's a very different thing than what people have been describing are these programmed 10b5 executive sales, which people have in place to do many, many of these sales. It's and look, as you know well, Emily, it's been covered in the business press. These are programs that the SEC put in place some 20 years ago in order to afford a mechanism by which people don't potentially misuse information in order to either prevent or effectuate sales with inside information. A consequence of that is that the mechanism that's been set up under certain circumstances, for instance, certain stock price movements or certain time passing, cause sales that optically create suspicion and doubt. And there's been a lot of pressure brought on multiple vaccine makers, unfortunately, including last week, some of the largest pharmaceutical companies. I can tell you that that issue is something that should be discussed, should be considered by the SEC and others. And if there are changes to be made, they should be made at a regulatory level. The notion that people should not avail themselves to plans that have been put in place in the past. In fact, as you may also know, some of these are things you can't change because the very act of stopping it is an informed, inside information-based act. And the people who've criticized know that. And the problem is that it makes for sensational covering. So I'm not defending what I'm not participating in because I don't have any kind of 10b5 plan. What Flagship side of this is an institutional decision, but the rest I think is something that will have to get discussed. And if improvements are needed, by all means, we'll happy to lead. One thing I'll say is that on the day that we started our phase 3 trials, we announced that we had suspended any further 10b5 program being put in place until the vaccines are approved. We're the only ones that I know have done that. And we did that because we could. Because at that point, we said, you know what, during the phase 3 trial, we don't really want additional sales and new programs. And so we put that in place. Some of these were put in place a long time ago.
Now, given the amount of money that Moderna has taken from taxpayers, how much liberty do you have to set the price yourself to develop your post-pandemic business model? Or is the government going to have to weigh in on that?
The government, so let's be clear. Moderna had spent some $2.5 billion developing its platform, with 10 vaccines having gone into clinical trials before SARS-CoV-2 landed on humanity, first. Second, the very first capital that was deployed for large-scale production was actually deployed by our shareholders. As you may know, early this year, we accessed equity raises of some 500 million and then eventually over $1 billion of shareholder capital that we put to this at risk. And along the way, certainly our relationship with BARDA grew. They funded our work in both producing and conducting clinical trials, so producing materials for them, and then that grew further. Finally, it culminated a couple of months ago in a large pre-order by the US government that further capitalized our work. So I'm giving that picture because it's not as though we were doing something else and then the government came along, gave us a grant, and then now we're doing it on their behalf. We're doing it regardless. And so as a result, the price negotiations are with individual groups that are buying. In the case of the US, we've announced a $100 million order with some possibilities of that being scaled up, and there's been a negotiated price that, by the way, took into account every last dollar of taxpayer money that was spent on this. So the average price is the operative price that we went by, as opposed to thinking of it separately as to what's a grant and then what is a purchase order. Others have mixed the two up to come up with different numbers, but we have not. And look, every country that we're negotiated with has gone through certain principled ideas, and one of them is volume. I mean, there are some people who want to access hundreds of millions of doses, others who want to access 5-10 million doses. So we want to make sure there's fair access. We want to make sure that there's rapid access, but also the cost that we're incurring is something that in each case will reflect certain guideposts that we've put in place. That has not been affected by the government.
You and your family came to Canada from Lebanon as refugees when you were 13 years old. And I understand you ended up at MIT Graduate School and you have founded 60 companies or something like that, and you're not even 60 years old. Where does this rank on the scale? I mean, do you imagine this will be your sort of, lifetime achievement?
Look, on a day where the team at Moderna has made a really grand, unprecedented achievement of a proof of concept, that's what we've achieved so far, and the readiness of the team, it would be difficult for me to say, no, I actually think that this will not rank high. It may rank as the highest, but I also, you should recognize that I have a team of about 150 people at Flagship Pioneering that are every year inventing some 6 to 8 new life science platforms, each of which have a Moderna glimmer in their eyes, and they absolutely are planning to transform other aspects of treatments, some preventative treatments, what we call preemptive therapeutics. These are what the future is going to consist of, is how do you get your body to anticipate and fight back disease long before you're afflicted by it. So I'm in a tough spot in the sense that we have an engine that can create new possibilities. We have phenomenal people who are devoted, courageous, ingenious people who are able to convert these possibilities into reality. Moderna certainly has set an unprecedented bar, one that we will continue to try to meet, but may not exceed, and so be it, because this is really a great achievement by the Moderna team.
And if mRNA can fight COVID, what else do you imagine it'll be able to fight? How else will we see? What other vaccines will we see mRNA be a part of?
Look, when we started in the early 2010 and then the following year or two, we thought many biologics, not just vaccines, but treatments, heart attack treatments of the sort that are entering phase 3 trials now with AstraZeneca, or cancer treatments of which we reported last week. So already we're doing much more than just infectious disease vaccines. But in the infectious disease area, I think this certainly should embolden us and embolden other people to believing that if this can be done, why aren't we doing it? So I'll ask you the question. Right now, we get a vaccine every year for influenza. It's about 50% effective. And we've been told that's kind of what you get, and you should be happy you're getting that. Next time you're flying on a 6-hour, 8-hour flight sitting next to somebody who has flu-like symptoms, are you going to accept that? And if you don't, are you going to be saying, you know what, to your government, to our government, hey, I want an effective pan-influenza vaccine? I don't see any reason why that's not a possibility, any more than developing a SARS-CoV-2 vaccine was an impossibility early this year, where people said if it takes any more than, if it takes any less than 2 years, something's wrong, it cannot be, it's unsafe. Clearly, today, people who've said that need to reconsider their position. And so if I was other pathogenic diseases, if I can be grandiose for a minute, I'd be worried. I'd be worried for the other pathogenic diseases. I think the human immune system will gradually have an efficient, reliable, and safe way to be trained to detect. We have on board, it's one of these, when you buy one of these, computers or iPhone stuff, and it has 100 times more storage capacity or compute capacity you'll ever need. Our immune system has vastly more therapeutic capacity than we've ever used. And therefore, once we start training it and unleashing it, I really do foresee a future filled with effective precision vaccines and much more.
There are skeptics out there who say we're all going to have COVID by the time these vaccines are ready, and that how can these pharma companies, now worth tens of billions of dollars, actually be worth that much? What's your response to that?
There's a lot of folks who said that, how could Amazon be worth what it was 10 years ago? I remember what people thought about Amazon, what people thought about Google, what people thought about any number of companies. And the reason is that the people who think about this world don't think about the power of information and what it can actually do and what it can undo. And that industry has never touched the pharmaceutical industry, which has been an esoteric, complicated, highly regulated to the advantage of the current incumbents. Guess what? That's going to change, because once you have an information advantage, that's going to be, so I can't talk about valuations only because, as you know well, Emily, valuations are a present value estimate of the future potential. On a day like this, as you ask me questions about what is possible, the notion that an influenza vaccine that's effective, one that is combined with a COVID vaccine, one that is combined with RSV, a CMV vaccine that afflicts more than half the world's population, that absolutely causes destruction of life, not just through pregnancy, but later in life. I mean, these are gigantic healthcare burdens. The notion that we'd be paying more for the stock of somebody who's storing something in data, or who's kind of sharing the economy, no offense to our tech colleagues, but that is lacking imagination on behalf of investors. Now, that's a possibility. We have a long way to go to earn that kind of evaluation. And I think our products, our performance will have to dictate that. But I do think that there's almost this kind of view that biotech is only ever going to be esoteric, and it's not. And I think, look, the impact it's having on the world is something that we either think this was a moment and then we all go back to business as usual, where we go back to doing things slowly and efficiently and effectively, or we persist and we say, what else can we do? That's the balance of whether these stocks are overvalued or grossly undervalued.